of Addiction podcast, which I'm doing live on YouTube every Sunday, believe it or not. And each week I'm going to help people in their addiction recovery, no matter what stage you're at. To let you know who I am Ashley Bloxham. I am a licensed therapist. I specialise in addictions and trauma. I've studied addiction. I've got like masters. I was doing my PhD in it. I've also overcame addiction because I am badass. Aren't we all? Aren't we all? And I've also been the loved one of addiction. So I really understand addiction from a 360 degree angle, every angle. And each week I just want to create a space where we can just hash it out and get real about it. Usually I'd have my co-host Barbara Shippen, but she's not here today. So just little me and Betty Big Bun. So today I want to talk about getting out of addiction and remembering who the hell you are. Because I think one thing that we can feel like when we're in addiction is that maybe, and you know, this isn't necessarily everyone's experience, but it's certainly a theme that I've realised myself and the people that I've worked with and others that I've spoken to about addiction, is that we have this undercurrent of a feeling or a belief that we're kind of failing because we're knee deep in this thing, which is absolutely just tearing our life apart, and we feel like we don't have the power to get out of it. Or when we get out of it, we feel like we can't sustain it for whatever reason. So what I want to talk about today is remembering who the F you are. Because the thing is, if you are able to endure addiction, like you're already badass. Like it's not for the faint-hearted. And I think sometimes we can feel a little bit weak, like why can't we stop? And actually, I say this all the time, this is my mantra, addiction is the symptom, it's not the problem. So if we think, do you know what it is, I'm enduring this, like I'm pretty badass to be dealing with all the host of emotions which come up with addiction. I can do this, but actually now what I've got to do is I've got to work out what's caused the addiction, and I need to start loving myself and healing. Now, healing also takes some endurance. It is not for the faint-hearted. However, if you can endure addiction day in, day out, you can endure healing. And that looks like doing things to face and remind yourself who you are. So when we're stuck in addiction or we're struggling in a recovery, we feel like, I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like I'm a bit of a letdown in some kind of way. And thanks. I've noticed some people are commenting. So I'm doing a live podcast, but I'm actually going to do a Q&A at the end. I should pin a comment. It's only my second time though, so we can just learn together. But yeah, we start to feel like, okay, we've got to heal if we get to that point. And to be able to heal, we need to start looking at the fact that, okay, maybe it's a bit too big to deal with whatever the addiction is a symptom of, but we could start to heal our relationships with ourselves. So that a really great way to start that is just get up and go. So start doing some kind of physical activity if you're able. Start paying attention to what you're eating. Just doing these little things where it's tangible wins you've got throughout your day. But set a goal of, I'm on this healing process now. And this can start before you even actually stop the addiction because, like I said, it's a symptom. I am going to have a little look at the comments, so see if there's anything to talk about. I'm not going to be heavy on the comments, so I do lives every day, but like I say, this is a podcast and I thought it'd be better to do it live. So we've got people who haven't got addiction. I was speaking to someone the other day and they were saying that a lot of people do have some kind of addictions, but not everyone. But I think one of the things I've realised that I have addictions to, even though I've got sober, is around social media. And I noticed that I look through social media when I'm feeling low. and it's usually an opportunity to start looking at what's going on in my life. But I have had drug addiction and other addiction to sugar. That was a big one as well. So we've got somebody who said I've been to the depths of gambling addiction. Yeah, so as an addictions counsellor, so I went private. I used to work for an organisation and then I decided to go private. And surprisingly, some of the most addictions that came through the doors was gambling and sex addiction, porn. And it was quite surprising, and I thought I was expecting drug and alcohol addiction, but actually I think these things, there's less support out there for them. Gambling addiction is horrendous. Like, it really annoys us how many different things have got ads. Even on podcasts, one of the biggest sponsors, I think, is Betfred's. It's really not cool, and I think it really angers us that that's something that's allowed. You know, it's like you shame people who have, like, the government I'm talking about, not me, but you shame people who are struggling with drug addiction, but then the plastering gambling adverts all over, and the advert is stay, Betsy, what's it, gamble away. Well, probably weren't thinking about it until they saw the advert. But yeah, well done though for getting through the depths of gambling addiction. I wonder what helped you with that. Hi, Football with Jack. Yeah, anything you point out, I can understand. And this is the thing. So we've got somebody saying anything that I point out around addiction, they can understand. And this is why I wanted to do the podcast and do lives, is because I think one thing that I've noticed from every person that I've spoke to about addiction is we can all understand each other. Although it might be a different addiction and it might have had different impacts, and we might have had, maybe some of us are functioning, maybe some of us aren't, maybe some of us have managed to keep it internal and suffered in silence. Maybe we've ended up hurting other people and then we've had to suffer in the limelight, which, you know, it's all awful, but I think we can all relate to each other. And every single person that I've spoke to about addiction, it's almost like, yeah, I get it. Whatever you're saying, I'm picking up what you're putting down. Now, someone's saying I'm addicted to turtles. I know somebody who is so addicted to dogs, like chihuahuas. I don't know them personally, I know of them, but they're so addicted to chihuahuas and buying chihuahua clothes and stuff that they had 13 chihuahuas, and their partner said, if you get a 14th one, I'm going to leave, and they went and got the 14th one. So I don't know if this person is joking about being addicted to turtles, but I think or if it's a legit thing, because you really do not know with addiction. But I think this is one of the things Gabor Mate talks about, being addicted to buying classical records, and he's one of the leaders in the field for addiction. If you don't know him, he's amazing, you should check him out. But I've followed him my full career, and I think sometimes we think that addiction's just these things like alcohol and drugs and smoking, because that's what it's framed as, but actually it's the dopamine that we're addicted to. We're addicted to that high, and I think sometimes reframing it as I'm addicted to dopamine can be helpful, because I don't know if any of the listeners have experienced this, but when you get sober, what is so common, hand up, because it's not just common what I've seen in other people, I also lived this experience. But what is common is often we can just replace one addiction with another. And that's because it's the dopamine that we're actually addicted to. Obviously, there's other, like with opiates, that's a different kettle of fish, because we're addicted to the dopamine, and then also the opiates is a natural pain relief and endorphins. We have opiate receptors, so it's kind of mimicking that. But a big component is dopamine, and what can be helpful in addiction recovery is to start thinking about, okay, I'm going to be removing whatever this thing is, which is going to be giving us huge hits of dopamine, what can I put back into my life which is going to also give us dopamine, which is going to be healthy? And I think exercise is a really good one. Ice baths, fasting, doing a challenging new thing. I do jiu-jitsu. I've mentioned that before, but that's like a brilliant one because you're having to learn whilst also being physical. Even just having a cold shower in the morning, it's great for dopamine. So yeah. So I began this talking about how to move forward and remembering who you are. And one of the things with remembering who you are is that often when we struggle with addiction, that becomes our identity. Not for everyone, but it certainly did for me. And it's almost like I forgot how to be Ashley Bloxham. I was just an addict. And this was a narrative I was telling myself all the time. And it was really hard for us to break free of that identity. So I started to just change the identity. I was just like, I'm just going through this, and actually I'm going to get through this, and I'm going to do this and that. And I started to think about what's this identity that I want to create? Who do I want to be when I step out of this? So I actually did a lot of things to get me to the place where I was ready to be sober before I actually was sober. And I started to start doing things that I would be doing if I loved myself, because I really understood through my training that it was a case of I didn't love myself, not that I was an addict. I didn't love myself enough to not have an addiction, to be able to back myself when it feels hard. Hi, buddy. So this is a live podcast, which I'm not sure how this is going to work. It's only my second time doing it, but I wanted to do a podcast. I've already got one, actually, a counselling one. But I thought it'd be quite good to do it online, because if anybody has any questions or anything to share about addiction and recovery, it means that I can answer them in real time. So do feel free to comment about anything to do with addiction. Oh, thank you for them crowns. I don't know what they mean. They look good. Yeah, so I did a lot of things to get sober before I was sober. And one of the main things that I started doing was reframing the addiction as something bad into something that I was doing to help myself. So I started to develop a healthy relationship, almost like a gratitude for my addiction, where I was thinking, do you know what it is? I have been through the mill in life. I've experienced, some huge traumas. I've got PTSD that I'm self-medicating. I also didn't know at this point that I had mental health disorders, which I was also self-medicating, which was making it difficult for me to break free of the addiction, but also making us susceptible to have the addiction in the first place. But I started to develop a gratitude for it and saying, I don't know how I could have coped with these traumas without the relevant care and support that I would need to get through it. So I'm kind of glad that I kept going, and this addiction's actually been really helpful in that sense, because it's helped us push down that pain and that shame that I've carried around for so long, and that trauma. So I started to be grateful for it, but not grateful where I was just surrendering to, okay, now I'm just going to struggle with addiction for the rest of my life, but grateful for it in a way to let go of shame and recognise that it served a purpose. And it's now my job to find a better way to medicate my traumas. And that looked like going to therapy, which was quite hard for me because I'm a therapist myself. So I was really struggled with the fact that I was a therapist and I was struggling with addiction. And I was struggling with addiction, and I also knew, so I'd already done a lot of training in addiction. I knew what I had to do to get out of the addiction, but none of the tools were working. And I was quite, I suppose, my ego was very I don't know the word. I want to say I was very anxious. My ego was very prideful and I didn't want to go to therapy, but I had to just sit down and say, you know, I have to. Even though I'm a therapist, I'm going to have to go and say, this is what I'm dealing with. So I do get how hard it can feel for people going to therapy to heal whatever it is that's driving the addiction. And it was quite sobering because as a therapist, you have people sitting in front of you and you think, don't think too much of them having that bravery to sit there and share things until you're sitting in the other seat and you're like, oh my God. And it really did help us have a newfound appreciation and empathy for my clients. But yeah, we do need to have gratitude for the addiction, but we also need to think, okay, I'm going to take the plunge, because healing is quite hardcore. It really is. I don't care what anyone says. It's not for the faint-hearted. But the difference is, so is addiction. And addiction is really painful to endure. And you just seem to feel worse and worse about yourself. It's a downward trajectory. Whereas healing is just as painful, because that's why we're having the addiction in the beginning, to suppress those feelings. But it's an upward trajectory. And it might go down first, but we can feel that growth and start to feel proud of ourselves and get back in touch with ourselves. So I'm going to go through some comments. You are really knowledgeable and clearly this is a real story. Any advice on where you get this amazing support and where others that feel helpless can find it? Thank you for that comment. That is really nice. Yeah, so there is quite a lot of different support out there. And one thing I will say, so AA meetings, there's a few things, or DA meetings, there's GA meetings, gambling, awareness, different things. I think that is really good because you have support groups. There's certain things that I would argue against as a therapist, which I think aren't as helpful, but generally I think support groups are brilliant, because one of the things about addiction is that we feel so isolated and disconnected and we feel like we're failing. You know, that's an inevitable byproduct of it. You know, maybe there's people out there who have addiction but who don't feel like they're failing, but that is great. But that's not the experience of the majority. And I think going to a support group and listening to people sit there and say, I've been through this, and saying their inspirational stories, you're like, wow, you know, I'm not the only person who's lent into addiction to deal with whatever I'm dealing with. And actually, if they can do it, I can do it. So that's a definite good place to start. And also you start to dismantle some of the shame around your story. So yeah, I know you said that this is clearly a real story. If you had spoke to us 3 years ago, I wouldn't dare be saying it, because I had that much shame around the fact that I struggled with addiction when I was pregnant and when I was a new mum. I was really shameful of that. As a counsellor, I struggled with addiction. So, and it was a drug addiction as well. It wasn't even, it wasn't something mild. So yeah, I think a really good place to start is starting to connect with people who've been through it. And who is it? His name escapes us. Who's that guy with long hair, but Jesus-like? His name's, it's, you know, when something's on the tip of your tongue, it'll come back to us. But there's somebody who does a lot of work for AA, and he's in the public eye, and he says that Russell Brand, there we go, got it. It always comes back if you try not to chase it. So Russell Brand was saying that it's always good to find a mentor, someone who's done it, and listen to them. So that's another reason why I think these support groups are good. Smart meetings are more practical. And practical strategies. Smart meetings, if you can find one of them, are actually grounded in counselling theory. But this is why I'm really avid on supporting people and putting my message out there. So I already had the intention of being an addictions counsellor before I was an addict. You might argue I was, because my psychiatrist said I was addicted to mind-altering substances, aka for the first like the whole of my 20s and the first part of my 30s, I was not sober. I was drunk or stoned or something, something recreational. So I already wanted to be an addictions counsellor because I had people around us who were really struggling, and I wanted to be a counsellor anyway. And I had this weird affiliation with it. So somebody has mentioned we all need Jesus Christ. I'm not religious, but since then I've become spiritual, and I do think we have a calling in life. We just need to learn to love ourselves enough to, you know, recognize what that purpose is and what our talents are and do it. But I've always had this affiliation with addiction. I've always been surrounded by it. And I didn't realize that what addiction felt like. So I wanted to be an addiction counsellor. I was studying it. I was doing my master's in it. And I had a very, I think, a very stereotypical view of what addiction is. Like, you should be able to stop. You just need the right support. And it was almost like the universe was like, okay, you want to be an addictions counsellor, do you, Ashley? Yeah, have a sprinkle of addiction. So I ended up developing an addiction whilst doing my training, which is absolutely mental. And the stuff that I learned wasn't that helpful. And I was getting really frustrated with it, and I couldn't understand why it wasn't helpful. And what I think it was is, in my counselling training, I was learning a lot about different traumas, and I started to recognise, actually, that's me. And I didn't have any support around us to process it. So I ended up going from recreational drug use to knee deep in addiction with ketamine. And one of the things I realised is none of the tips and tricks I was learning for addiction, I was doing course after course, was helpful. And I was also studying counselling. So this is a long-winded way of answering the question, where can you get help and support? I think the biggest help and support you can get outside of speaking to like-minded people is yourself, learning to love yourself. Because you cannot fight addiction if you are fighting yourself. You really can't. You know, you're about to take on this hefty war in your mind. It's going to be battle of the addiction versus you, the person, in my case, me, Ashley. And you can't do that if you are not backing yourself. You're setting yourself up to fail. If you're beating yourself down and the addiction's beating you down, you're not going to be able to do it. And especially when you have relapses, or in the addiction industry, we call it lapses if it's little. But if you're having like a lapse or relapse, you know, it takes tremendous strength to pick yourself back up again and say, you know what it is, I have messed up, I feel ashamed, I feel rubbish, but I'm going to continue doing it. Or if you get triggered or something bad happens in your life. My relationship broke down and I became a single mom. And the level of strength it took to not fall back into addiction, because I was only a month sober, was tremendous. But because I'd learned to love myself, that was my biggest push forward. Let's see what else. So yeah, I hope that was helpful, and thank you for the comment though, Jordan. It was very kind. There's somebody's commented in a different language, and I don't know what it says, but it's got a lot of hearts, and I love that. I think that is the biggest antidote to addiction, is love. And there's somebody, oh God, I am forgetting names today. There's a really great TED Talks, and I actually interviewed him a while back. And he did a fantastic TED Talks, and it was on about the war on drugs, and he was saying addiction needs love, not war. And I remember watching this specific TED Talks, and it made us really cry. And this was before I had my addiction, because it really helped us understand addiction in a different light. And it was literally talking about how love is so important for recovery. And addiction is the opposite of love from society, love from ourselves. So it's a really great TED Talks. I'm going to try and remember his name, but seems like my thoughts are escaping us today. So we're coming up to the end, And if anybody has any questions, now is a good time. But I want to end on something that King Zebulon has said, which is, we all need Jesus Christ. And I think that a lot of people that have struggled, don't worry, if you're not if you're not religious, don't worry, I'm not going to start pushing it down your throat. That's just to put that out there, because I think some people might be like, right, I had enough. But here is out. So I spoke to somebody who had struggled with addiction, and they said that, isn't it weird that nearly everybody who's went through addiction that I've met is now religious or is spiritual? And I was like, do you know what it is? I have to agree. A lot of people are. I'd say a good percentage, a hefty percentage. And I think, going back to what Jordan has said, is, where can you find help? To marry these two comments together is, I think that it's important that we feel connection to something outside of ourselves, that we feel part of a bigger purpose. Now, that doesn't need to be religion, or it doesn't need to be spirituality, but it could just be in humanity. I don't know other people's experience, this is my personal experience, but I almost felt shunned by society. I felt like I did not belong in society. I felt like the dregs of society, like the scum of the earth, which wasn't true. But these were the messages I was telling myself, because there is such a heavy emphasis on the war on drugs. You know, policy is saying that is blaming the individual for the drug use. So, you know, it makes sense that there's such a big stigma around it. So I felt really disconnected from anything other than my addiction, which was so dangerous, because as soon as I felt like I was outside of my community, I didn't feel a part of humanity, I didn't have faith or religion or anything like that, I felt so lonely. And that was a really dangerous spot to be in, because as humans, we are tribal creatures. And if you look at tribes, we are naturally spiritual. I'm not saying that's right. You know, there's actually a fish which I saw in a documentary, which they said would be classed as a spiritual fish, because it's very ritualistic, and actually we are wired up for religion and spirituality in our brains. There's certain mechanisms which get activated, which is the same as drug use, by the way, which is interesting. There's an interesting study on that. But we are naturally inclined to feel something bigger than us, because we're not an individual, we're part of a tribe, we're meant to be part of something bigger. So if that is leaning into Jesus, into spirituality, into crystals, into the universe, or into just the fact that I'm a human being and I am just as deserving of life and participate in this crazy little thing that is life as everybody else in humanity, you can start to break outside of this internal prison that we're in when we're struggling with addiction. So yeah, I thought I'd end on that. I've enjoyed this. Thank you everybody who's joined the podcast and who's commented and liked. I really appreciate that. Please do like and subscribe if you want, although it is helpful because I am new to YouTube, and yeah, that would be helpful if you've enjoyed this. And yeah, see you next Sunday for the Sunday service of addiction. And next week I'm going to have my co-host, because she is currently away living it up in a caravan park at the moment, living the dream. So she's going to be joining us next Sunday, and she is very inspirational and brilliant, and she's also a giggle. So I look forward to that. See you next Sunday at 11:11. Take care. Thank you for saying thanks for sharing. I appreciate that. Bye.